I'm pleased to have here a fantastic panel representing a wide range of experience, both as practitioners investing in renewable energy, as I am myself, in the growing Indian market, and in ensuring some of those risks, and in the public-private partnership of moving forward those markets. So the names of our four panelists now, Mr. Aruma Ghosh, Dr. Aruma Ghosh, sorry, I beg your pardon, sir. He's a very learned individual. He's CEO of the Council of Energy, Environment and Water. We have then Amit Singh, who is CEO of one of India's possibly the biggest renewable energy developer and operator, Adani Green Energy Limited. We have Mark Potter from Aon. Mark is Chief Commercial Officer and Industry Vertical Leader for Power and Renewables in Aon. And then Dr. Amoli Amin, who is a Managing Director in British International Investments, which, to save her saying it, used to be known as CDC, but we actually now generally just use British International Investments. So look, I'm going to kick off in what we've heard already. What an exciting and hugely ambitious set of targets that the Indian government has set for the renewable energy sector. So it should all be pretty straightforward then. Where are the sweet spots for the sort of alignment of government and subnational frameworks with the sort of sustainable energy push, and where might the challenges be?
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Richard, and thanks for having me in this conversation. Great to be here. Let me just offer a few quick numbers. 20, 500, 5.6 million, 10 trillion. In 2010, when our national solar mission began, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. We now have about 180,000 megawatts of solar, of renewable and non-fossil electricity capacity, but we need to get to 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030, which effectively means that the half an hour we spend having this chat, we should have deployed another 5 megawatts. Every hour, about 11 to 12 megawatts of renewables we got to deploy. But that exponential growth that has happened thus far will seem like a blip compared to the 5.6 million megawatts of solar alone that we'll need for net zero, 1.8 million megawatts of wind that we'll need for net zero. And as my organization CEW calculates, that is a $10 trillion requirement over the course of the next 50 years. So where are the sweet spots? As investors, I'm assuming you are not looking at the very long term. So if you look at the medium term up to 2030, the sweet spot is not finance but investment, which is basically the $550 billion of investment opportunity that India is offering this decade alone in renewables, in electric mobility, and in green hydrogen. These three will be the critical drivers this decade. What will be the challenges? On the renewable side, grid integration and storage. On the mobility side, the infrastructure for charging. On the green hydrogen side, who's going to buy it? If we can solve these three aspects of these problems, the exponential growth does not look impossible, but challenging yet doable. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. If I might move on to you, obviously since we started this panel, you must have done at least 1 megawatt, right? Maybe a bit more, right? Because that's 5 minutes have gone. But listening earlier, NITI are saying that they're got a mission to try and increase the sort of contractor base in India. There's all these other infrastructure sectors we've been hearing about as well. So although the scale of the challenge looks massive, you've got all that land to get, you've got to build, you've got to find the contractors to do this, you've got to do it safely so that international and domestic investors feel comfortable putting their capital to work in the sector. So how are you going to do it?
Yeah, no, I think it's been talked about in the morning that some level of consistency and ability to predict is important. So the way you get that is being proactive about the plans. I think the plans which were just being talked about, we strongly believe are very achievable if we plan for it properly and execute on that plan. And I'll give you 4 dimensions we focus on in Adani Green Energy. The first one is securing your resources. I mean, to be able to have a predictive execution, we need to know where the land areas are. We need to have 2 to 3 years of data acquisition for weather data, so we can make sure that we can be very precise about our investments in wind or solar, or even in the future on pump storage business as well. So having a very proactive plan where we secure that land parcels, large land parcels, allows us to move at speed when we start moving. The second is really excellence in execution. And that comes from focusing very heavily on, as you rightly pointed out, on safety, developing a supplier base which is diverse, which is scalable, because we are working in different parts of India. We are working with different skill sets, and it's only ramping up. And developing that ecosystem of suppliers, whether it is on technology side or people or skills of deploying these technologies, is something we need to keep an eye on and keep on progressing, because it's starting to become a bottleneck if we don't plan it well. The third is application of technology, digital and AI. If you look at in our group, in spite of the growth cannot happen just by putting human at work. The O&M, or the operations and maintenance vertical, and that's a dimension we need to bring robotics to make sure that the cleaning is happening and optimizing our performance. We are bringing analytics and AI technologies to predict problems so we can maximize uptime of our plants, which essentially assures that the investment premises we made at the time of construction is what we see when we operate, because we don't want to have a lot of delta, and it assures the investors that we are able to do that over a long period of time. And the fourth dimension, which is also equally important, is sustainability. We want to do this through the lens of sustainability, through the lens of making sure that, just to give you some examples, we are water positive. We are able to actually contribute 10% extra water than we use in every site we have operating today. We have 0 plastic use. We don't send anything to landfills. So these 4 dimensions are always important, and that guides me and my team in making decisions and making sure that we deliver on the plan which was just being talked about.
Thank you very much, Amit. That dimension of the almost sustainability within a sustainable sector, I think, is really interesting. And there's a number of different dimensions to that. Amalie, maybe talk. BII has done some fantastic pioneering work in the Indian market and elsewhere on trying to help the market mature and also, improve the lives of citizens, through its investments in a variety of sectors, and particularly in this kind of renewable energy space and sustainable infrastructure space. Maybe you could share some of what you're doing and where you see that role of public capital and how it can best have an impact in helping India scale up.
Yeah, thank you. So, as we've actually been invested in India as CDC, formally since 1987. And we are a long-term, patient capital investor. And I think, as you said, Richard, we're in it to see a real development return, as well as helping to build out businesses and in particular help create jobs and all the economic benefits that go with that. And that's really core to our mandate. So in terms of the renewable space, well, India also, just to say, actually, India is the biggest part of our portfolio, around $2.2 billion. And of that, roughly 42% is direct equity. But in the renewable space, we actually, in 2018, we created a platform, Ayana Renewable Power Limited, which some of you will probably be aware. So we made that investment in 2018. In 2020, we actually, there was a second round of capital raise, which brought in equity from the National Investment in Industry Infrastructure Fund, NIIF, and the Global Green Equity Fund. And actually has been really quite a remarkable success in achieving some scale, or demonstrating scale. As of 2022 last year, we were 1 gigawatt of capacity. Now almost 4 gigawatts, and by 2025 should be on track for 10 gigawatts of renewables. So I think that was a very interesting way in which we created this platform. We've attracted domestic capital, and potentially we will be looking for other investors to come in to continue to scale, and potentially there may not be a role for us as a patient investor, given how successful the renewables market is scaling in India. That said, I think there are other sectors where we see, and I think this was mentioned by that we really need to see and find the opportunities to invest more in those enabling technologies and systems, so grid infrastructure, in particular smarter grids, battery storage. We have started to, we've invested in a couple of utility scale battery storage in Africa, one in South Africa, one in Mozambique, which actually was through some grant funding we had, because obviously not yet economic, but really critical technologies to bring in more renewables over time. So, increasingly, I think we're seeing our focus probably shifting more into those types of sectors as a way, given the private sector now is coming into renewable power generation.
That makes a lot of sense, Emily. And I would comment, I think, including in the UK India Sustainable Finance Working Group, I remember when we started that with the fantastic support of the City of London and FICCI. One of the things we identified was the scope for green INVITs to just tweak those regulatory reforms and start mobilising the large amounts of domestic capital that, as we heard earlier, is seeking more of a move into alternatives, and doing that in a de-risked way through a sort of yield co-type structure, which is a model that has worked well in more mature renewables markets. It's super exciting and part of the story, not the whole story, but that sort of credentialising those platforms and moving them on is really important. Here in the City of London, a centre of insurance. Mark, what sort of role, and I think you're building out in India, as the platform at the moment, and obviously that will have a massive exponential boost when the FTA is signed. Obviously, we're all very confident of that. But tell us, what can you and the insurance sector sort of offer the sort of development of the renewables and sustainable infrastructure sector in India and investors looking to come into that area?
Sure, thank you, Richard. And it's a pleasure to be here today and to represent Aon and to discuss the world of insurance as well, and risk transfer when it comes to energy and power, in particular around renewables. We're an important part of the sector, and as you say, we've got a rich heritage around it in terms of supporting trade globally and the growth of innovation globally as well. And I believe that therefore we've got a strong role to play also as well in the future development of the sector in India. When I think about bankability, I always think about insurability as well. With that, it needs to be underpinned by that. So I think that we can play a key role in supporting investors into the sector. I remember about 15 years ago, so it was a bit more than 20 megawatts of solar at the time, but we had a team of underwriters join us from India and work with us and train up and then go back into the India insurance market. And since then, the Indian insurance market has blossomed for around renewables, especially around onshore renewables, and is now very capable in terms of dealing with the risk transfer needs for onshore renewables locally for the majority of product needs, although there are some other things that can be bolted on around there to help with risk transfer for investors. And I'm seeing the same thing now happen around other areas for renewables in terms of how we can continue to support the growth of that sector. There's new, and also as well actually supporting our clients there as well. I'm starting to work with developers from Europe that are going into India, and we're insuring the projects in India with our team in India and helping to transfer that risk and translate the risk into products that are very bankable from a lender perspective. So it's a key part in terms of that working together in there. But there's more that we can all do. and certainly in terms of how we can support our team that we're building up in India as well. So what other products can we use to help transfer risk? So is it around mergers and acquisitions? Is it around warranties and indemnities we can help to protect with some of those investments? Is it around performance risk with battery storage, for instance, to help protect yields that you might be getting from projects? There's all sorts of different ways that we can look at risk transfer in an innovative way to be able to support the sector going forward. And when I look on the horizon in terms of plans for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which is about the same as what Aon has advised on over the last 20 years. So it's a huge amount of projects to be looked at. There's a lot of knowledge that we've gained from that process, and the insurance market as a whole has gained, that will also help India to develop the offshore wind insurance market eventually, that will help with the cost-effective risk transfer and support those future project developments.
Thank you, Mark. What sort of, as we sit here in the City of London, how does Adani sort of look at sort of global partnerships and, with capital and other kinds of partnerships to sort of take forward your plans in India and for the renewables sector more broadly in the country?
Sure. I think if you look at, the plans which were just being shared to deliver 500 gigawatt, we have put together our business plan to deliver a minimum of 45 gigawatt of renewable capacity by 2030. We're sitting on install base of 8.1. We are under construction to deliver 20. So we have a very solid pipeline, and we are really accelerating our speed of execution per year from 2 to 3 to move to 6 and 6.5 to be able to deliver that plan. What that means is that if you look at per unit capex, it's around 0.6 million for solar, 0.7 million per megawatt for wind, plus or minus. And the investment needed is significant. And we will need, in India, I think it's all been talked about in the morning, there are a lot of short duration instruments, but we are assuring confidence in what we do by executing on time, by delivering on time. We are making proactive steps to maximize our performance of install base. So we're giving assets which are very predictable, which should mean that we should be able to raise capital at a competitive rate on a longer term basis, so we can execute these at much faster scale. So that will be one area of interest and focus for us. Second area I would like to talk about is, the cost of storage solutions is still quite significantly high. So that needs to be brought down, and I think technology and investments in that direction will help. So that's another area of focus and partnerships I think we'll be open to and happily talk to people if there is an interest. And those two together can deliver on the round-the-clock renewable supply, which we're aspiring for. The pump hydro projects we're executing as well, but these three things together will kind of bring the cost element down to make it more sustainable and affordable for the communities.
Thanks, Amit. Aaron, how much do you think, when you look at the challenge, the scale ahead, how much is grid development going to be a sort of constraining factor, and what do you think the answer is in terms of, ensuring that the grid can deal with both, the intermittency, which is part of the storage issue, but just the sheer volume, of generation that's going to be coming onto the grid?
Yeah, I think we've got to start imagining power markets very differently. Of course, the grid will be important. In the 8 renewable-rich states over the last few years, we've got about over 5,000 kilometers of green energy corridor related grids that have been built out. Also, over the next another 3 years or so, India will deploy about 300 million smart meters, which hopefully should be able to optimize at the household level or the consumption level the kind of electricity usage. But if you actually think about it, which is why I talked about the 5.6 million megawatts of solar needed for net zero, according to our calculations, ultimately power markets of the future are going to look very different compared to the past. And that's not just the India story, it's across the world, which means that even to meet the 2030 targets, let alone the 2070 targets, we will need to think about not just the large scale projects that have already been built, and we have a sense of how to do that much more rapidly and at lower capex. But we've got to start thinking about how do you deploy distributed energy, but which is grid interactive, not just standalone, very quickly. How do you deal with these, thousands of prosumers? How do you optimize for their energy consumption? And most importantly, how do you trade those electrons? So I think Amit talked about beyond renewables, the technology and AI, but I think it's not just the decarbonization revolution, but the digitalization revolution that needs to go hand in hand along with the decentralization revolution. These three will kind of shape the narrative. And unless grid operators, electricity planners, project developers, and consumers start thinking about that new paradigm of what electricity markets are going to look like, we will struggle to meet in a vanilla kind of project investment way the kinds of targets that have been set out. If we start imagining that different future, then we can say, as a project developer, as an investor, as a policymaker, as a subnational actor, what's my role in creating those power markets in the future? And I think those who are at the lead of that will have an edge as we build out this very different power system in India.
Yeah, thanks. You were in Paris last week, Amelie, at the sort of new Financing Pact Summit hosted there, which, and there was quite a lot of talk there among the sort of MDBs and other capital providers, and also private capital providers, of how we manage what is a transition. 80% of energy is fossil fuel based at the moment in India, and typically that's not unusual around the world. Lots and lots of green electrons adding onto the system. How do we sort of make sure we sort of mobilize capital, and is there are people feeling uncomfortable about how they manage that risk?
Yeah, well, I think, as a result of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, this issue of transition risk is now something we're all, as investors, having to really address and understand, and have data from the likes of Aon and others. And I think what we are seeing, and we as BAI, we've actually been looking at in both India and also in South Africa, what is the role of the financial sector in a just transition, and how do you help ensure that these socioeconomic benefits of the transition are widely shared, and you minimize the potential negative implications of a transition, particularly for those. We talk a lot about the coal sector, but I think that other sectors too. I think also some sectors maybe, or some regions, certain sectors may also become non-viable in light of climate change as well. So, being able to understand better those opportunities for the transition, and it's unlikely to be a direct replacement from coal jobs and coal sector job to renewables, but there could well be other sectors in those areas that can be effectively transitioned. And really, I think the key is also around skills and skill set. We as an investor, it's not something we normally would do that. However, when we invested in Ayana, the renewable platform, we did with the British High Commission in Delhi, we did provide some training, a lot of training to women in particular. We have a strong focus on creating quality jobs for women as part of our gender lens investing, and so for women in the renewable sector, in the utility renewables sector. So, I think these types of interventions are going to be increasingly important to come alongside. And obviously in India, there's huge sort of wealth in terms of human capital, and how to really mobilize that so it really is leading the way in terms of this transition. I just want to also just fully endorse that last point about the changing power markets, and we do need to think quite differently. We're also looking at smart metering, which, how you can encourage those that have, solar on their roofs, other forms of energy to be selling back to the grid, or reducing demand at certain peak times, which even here now in the UK is starting to become, some of the energy suppliers are looking at that as a way, recognizing it's not just adding more kilowatts into the system, but it's actually improving the services, the energy services for all, and recognizing that technology and digitalization is critical and a key enabler of that.
100%. Thank you very much. And I'm glad you highlighted the sort of some of the social dimension as well. Actually, it's come across through a number of our answers here from the panel, which is something that the City of London, through the previous Lord Mayor and the present one, big focus. There was a summit recently around some of that social impact of finance in particular, and I think it's a really important dimension that we do well to remember. Now we're almost out of time, but before I let you go, give me in 2 words what you think is the most positive opportunity in this sector in India. Mark, go first.
Just 2?
Just 2.
Energy transition. But
okay, Emily.
Unlocking human capital, so I'll hyphenate one of those 2 words.
Okay, human capital together, that's fine. Amit?
I'll maybe say speed of execution, and confidence in delivery.
Okay, Aaron, they're getting longer.
Managing risk.
Perfect. Would you like to give the panel a round of applause?